Hi, and welcome to the show. This is episode 18. Thank you for joining me again, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm so glad you're here. If this is your first time listening, welcome. This podcast is for parents who homeschool and for parents who are thinking about homeschooling, and even for parents who simply want to learn more about how to support their child at home. And I want to make this very clear right now as we begin. This is not a podcast meant to convince anyone to homeschool or to take their kids out of school. It's been a great week this week, but also it has come with some challenges this week. So every family is different and every child's different. Public schools work well for some families. Private schools work well for others. And then some parents take their kids to their charter schools or co-ops, micro schools. I mean, there's so many options. And homeschooling, is a different type of way of teaching your child. So again, my goal isn't to tell you which educational path you should choose. My goal is to help you become a more confident parent and a more thoughtful educator, no matter where your child goes to school. Because whether your child attends public school 5 days a week or learns around your kitchen table, one thing never changes, and that's parents parents are a child's first teacher. Children spend many hours at school, but they spend years growing up at home. The value they learn, the habits they build, the conversations they have, and the examples they see every day are shape a person. And this is going to determine who they will become as they get older and become adults. So in this podcast, we talk about learning, child development, family relationships, current events, books, history, and really anything that comes to my mind. So today's episode is definitely one of those. I've had a lot of stuff in my mind, so it's going to be a great show. So here's what's been on my mind. I've been thinking a lot about becoming a teacher, right? Before I became a teacher, I actually worked, as you know, at a law firm. But before that, I was actually a massage therapist. Most people don't actually know that because it was when I was really young, right out of high school. I took some classes for massage therapy, and I worked in this field as I went to college. And then I really didn't enjoy it. I mean, I enjoyed it a little. I enjoyed the people that I worked with, like the other staff members. But the clients, it was always hard to know what environment I was going to get myself into when I'd enter a room. And I guess the majority of the time, the clients were nice and weren't creepy. And so that's why I left that field, and then I instead started working at law firms as a paralegal. So when people hear teacher, they usually imagine that's what I've always done. But like many people, I've had several careers before arriving in education. And working as a massage therapist taught me many things about professionalism, communication, and serving others. It also taught me something much more difficult. Sometimes people behave in ways that, cross professional boundaries. Occasionally, a client would make inappropriate comments or advances that were completely unacceptable. And those situations were uncomfortable, and sometimes they were frightening. And so when that happened, my responsibility was to end the session, leave the room if necessary, and make sure, I was safe. And those experiences still stay with me. When I decided to become a teacher, I honestly believed I was entering a profession where respect for educators would be stronger. I thought schools have rules. I thought that there are administrators, there are policies. So surely this environment will be different. In many ways, it is. Teaching is an incredibly rewarding profession, and I've met wonderful students, supported families, and dedicated colleagues. But I also learned something I wasn't expecting, and that's that schools are not immune from difficult situations. Teachers sometimes experience verbal aggression. Sometimes it can be physical. And most of the time, they're blamed for problems they didn't even create. So one of the hardest things for me has been trying to explain that caring about a child and being concerned about unsafe behavior are not opposites. I have heard comments like, "You just don't like that student," and I remember thinking, no, that's not it at all. It's really, I can genuinely care about a child who also while also recognizing that certain behaviors, are just unsafe and out of line. And so those two ideas can exist at the same time. If a child is hitting a classmate, throwing furniture, or hurting adults, it's okay to say this behavior needs to change. This can even happen at home as a parent, actually. And so that doesn't mean we've stopped caring about the child. In fact, sometimes caring means having difficult conversations and helping children learn safer ways to express themselves. And so I've actually learned over time that it's important that we separate the child from the behavior. So what this means really is that children have strong emotions, and only because they're experiencing these strong emotions, it doesn't mean that they are bad people. If they start saying bad words, they might just be repeating something they've heard, and they need to learn how to work these things out and be taught how to deal with feelings. So therefore, children deserve their dignity, and they deserve people to be patient around them, and they deserve that opportunity to learn. And so if you're a parent and your child is acting out in public, that can be very difficult because people are judging. They are looking at the child and thinking the worst things about them. And so that's where we need to still be patient and ignore other people's interpretations, and you need to understand that you're the professional, or you're the parent, and the adult, so you need to handle this. So everyone in a classroom, whether it is at home or at school, it needs to be safe. And teachers and parents, they also deserve to be safe in their own home and or at the workplace. So this really determines if you're a teacher and you're working in a classroom or you're home. And this is kind of the thing that's been holding you back from homeschooling your child, is because they've got some sort of behavior. So therefore, even the student themselves, they need to be safe. And so sometimes when they're acting out, that jeopardizes their own safety. So those goals don't compete with one another. They actually support each other. So one thing I've learned over the years is that there are rarely simple answers. Some kids are just working through trauma. Maybe they witnessed, domestic violence or some sort of violence, or even, some sort of violence. It could have been outside of the home, and maybe it wasn't domestic violence, but something. And so they're working through this trauma, and some have developed developmental differences. So And when you go to teaching interviews, they will always ask you that question: how do you as a teacher differentiate instruction? And so even at school, not all the students are completing the same tasks. So you should never, if you're a homeschooling parent, you should never try to you should be teaching your child based on their skill levels and growing that way, and not try to compare your child to somebody else's child. And this goes even in the class, when you send your child to school, because some kids just need that extra support, and some are testing poorly, because that's a normal part of development. Every child has a story, but every classroom also has 20 or 30 other stories happening at the same time. And that's why teaching is so challenging. When you're at a school, it's one teacher, with 30 kids sometimes. And that's challenging. And parents face similar challenges at home. So sometimes you try everything you've read in the parenting books or the teacher books, and you remain calm. You establish a routine, you give choices, and you explain the expectations. And still your child is struggling with a particular behavior. So like you could have set the steps. You could have said, come here, for example, and your child is refusing to come to you or hold your hand while you're crossing the street, for example. I think those things, they come with time and again, extra practice and support. So if you've even been in that position, I want you to know you're not alone. There isn't a parenting book that can predict every situation you will face. That's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this today, because somewhere along the way, we've started believing that if something isn't working, someone must be doing something wrong. Maybe it's the parent, the teacher, or even the child. And sometimes that's just not true. But many times parenting and teaching are simply difficult, not because anyone is at fault, but it's because children are growing, they're changing, they're testing ideas and limits, developing independence, and learning how the world works. So there's no perfect formula. There's no checklist that guarantees success every single time, and that's okay. I think one of the healthiest things we can do as parents and educators is to admit that we are also learning. And we should be learning alongside our children, and figuring out what motivates them, as well as how to help them feel secure. You're learning when to be flexible and when to hold firm. This isn't weakness, that's wisdom, okay? So a lot of the times, teachers would give me advice, and I would do what they said, that they would say, but instead it seemed to make the student worse. So that's why we have to be flexible, and there's no right or wrong. It's just going through trial and error. So again, there's no parenting playbook really. There's many books, and they give great suggestions, but that's what they should be. They're suggestions, and you can try them out and see how it goes. So one of the reasons I enjoy talking about education is because my background isn't just in teaching. So I was I was first a student, and then I became a massage therapist, and then I became a paralegal, and but actually, right after paralegal studies, I actually got my bachelor's, like I said, in anthropology. And now when people hear the word anthropology, they usually think about digging up dinosaur bones, and that's actually paleontology. And an anthropologist, studies people, how culture develops, how societies function, how families pass tradition from one generation to the next, and how human behavior changes across different environments. That background has influenced how I think about parenting and education. And so, in an anthropological perspective, one of the first things you learn is that there are very few universal answers. Different cultures solve the same problem in different ways. So some children grow up in large extended families, others grow in small nuclear families. So some cultures expect children to contribute to household responsibilities at a very young age, while others emphasize play for a much longer period during childhood. So despite all of these differences, children still grow into adults. They're still going to be adults, and that taught me something important. There's rarely just one right way to raise a child. Now, it is really windy here, and I think the audio is it's gonna come out through the audio. But I am a parent, and like I said, this week has been great. But at the same time, we had our challenges, and I have to. I also have my own ambitions, and I wanted to start this podcast to help other parents out and give out information. So I'm recording out in the outdoors, and it's just windy today. So years ago, my older daughter found out I studied anthropology, and she looked at me with a completely serious face and asked me, "Mom, did you have me as some kind of an experiment?" And of course, I laugh every time I think about it, of course. And the answer is, of course not. But there was a tiny part of me that understood why she asked that, because every parent is constantly observing, watching, learning, and adjusting. And not because our children are experiments, but because every child is different. And there's no parenting book that can prepare you for your particular child. Books can teach principles, like I said. They can explain child development. They can offer wonderful ideas. But eventually, there comes a moment when you close the book and say, "Okay, now what? What is my child doing right now? What are we supposed to be doing?" Because your child didn't, remember, your child didn't read the book. And they didn't get the memo at birth. Your child has their own personality, their own strengths, and their own struggles, fears, and sense of humor. Even they can be stubborn. They can be moments of stubbornness. And you begin realizing that parenting isn't about finding the answer. It's about finding the answer that works for your family while still raising a responsible and kind human being. So we spend so much time talking about teaching children critical thinking, but parents need it too. You have to learn to evaluate the advice. Sometimes you'll hear, "You should never do this," or "You should always do that." So whatever I hear those kinds of words like always and never, I become cautious. Life is rarely that simple. Parenting certainly isn't. Every family has different circumstances, and every child has different needs. So one strategy may work beautifully with one child and completely fail with another. And so that doesn't automatically mean that the strategy was bad. It just means that children are individuals, and That's why I encourage parents to think critically and to read books, listen to experts, learn from teachers, talk with pediatricians, seek advice from experienced parents, but then ask themselves, does this fit my child? And that question, I think it's the most important question of all. So here's something I've been thinking about a lot. There comes a point in childhood when something changes. It's difficult to identify exactly when it happens because it happens differently for every child, but suddenly kids just understand much more than we realize. And sometimes adults continue speaking to children as though they are still toddlers or babies. And meanwhile, the child has already figured out how the system works. And children are incredibly observant. They're always observing everything, and they notice patterns. They learn through cause and effect, and they learn which adult is likely to say yes, and which adult is willing to give in, and so which adult follows through, which adult their rules are negotiable, and which parent isn't. So that's not manipulation in the adult sense. It's just learning. Children are constantly gathering information. They know what they want. Okay, they know what they want, and they want to get what they want, and they're going to get it, and they're going to figure it out how to get it because they really want it. So they're trying to understand how their world operates. And as parents, part of our responsibility is helping them understand that boundaries aren't random. Rules aren't there to simply because adults enjoy making rules. They're there because children are still learning judgment. And so think about a toddler running towards a busy street. You don't stop to negotiate. You don't begin a 20-minute discussion about traffic laws. You move immediately, you pick them up, and you guide them away from danger. Afterwards, once everyone is safe, that's when the conversation begins. You explain, you teach, and you help them understand the why. And so as children grow older, those conversations become even more important. It doesn't end at, toddler age and not, looking both ways and all that and holding your hand. We gradually move from simply stopping unsafe behavior to helping children understand why certain choices matter. Like, why is learning how to read and doing math so important? So, and learning history and maybe another language. And it could be all kinds of things. So eventually, we hope they begin to make wise decisions, even when we're not there. When you send them off to school and you're not looking at them and all that. So that's really the goal, is not blind obedience. It's just good judgment. Not because they're afraid, but because they understand. We don't want to make them feel afraid. We just want them to understand the situations. So let me give another example. Now imagine you've been looking forward to your older daughter's dance recital for months, for example, and the entire family is excited, but your younger child is having an incredibly difficult day. They're disrupting the event, they're running around the auditorium, they're ignoring every direction and creating an unsafe situation. So that doesn't automatically mean the strategy was bad. It means children are individuals. That's why I encourage parents to think critically. They need to be reading books, and they can do these things, or listen to other experts or the teachers, the pediatricians, seek advice from experienced parents. But then you need to ask yourself, does this fit my child? That question matters. And here's something I've been thinking about a lot also, is that there comes a point in childhood when something changes. It's difficult to identify exactly when it happens because it happens differently for everybody. But there's that sudden moment and that comes to you all of a sudden, that your child understands more than we realize. So this all is how we've been treating our child from the very beginning when they're very young. And sometimes adults continue speaking to their children as though they're still toddlers for longer than they should. And meanwhile, the child has already figured out how, the world around him works. And children are incredibly, observant. They're always observing, and they notice the patterns, and they love patterns. You'll see them doing it all the time. They'll build patterns at a really young age, and they quickly learn cause and effect. They learned, which parent will say yes, which one will say no or gives in, as well as the parent that follows through with what they say, and which rules are negotiable and which rules are not. That's not manipulating. It's just learning. Children are constantly gathering information, and they're trying to understand how their world operates. Children will go above and beyond to get what they want. And as parents, part of our responsibility is to help our children understand that boundaries, they're not random. The rules aren't there just because adults enjoy making rules and, I tell you, you have to do. They're there because children are still learning judgment, and you'll have to teach your child this throughout their education, while they're minors. So think about a toddler running towards a busy street. You don't stop and negotiate at that point. You don't begin a 20-minute discussion about traffic laws. You move quickly and immediately, and you pick them up and you guide them away from the danger. And then afterwards, you can talk about what happened and how to be safe. And that's where the conversation begins. You explain and then you teach. You help them understand the whys. And as children grow older, those conversations become more important. And we gradually move from simply stopping unsafe behavior to help children understand why certain choices matter. Eventually, we hope they begin making wise decisions even when we're not there. That's really the goal. It's not blind obedience, but just having good old-fashioned judgment. And not because, they're afraid instead, but because they understand. And here's another example. Imagine you've been looking forward to your older daughter's dancing recital for months. The entire family is excited, but your younger child is having an incredibly difficult day. They're disrupting the event. They're running around the auditorium. They're ignoring every direction, and they're just creating an unsafe situation. So every parent hopes that never happens, but sometimes life throws us difficult moments. And in situations like that, there may not be a perfect solution. You might have to step outside with one of your child while another family member stays inside. You might have to miss part of the recital. You might need to leave early, and that's painful, and it certainly is unfair. But sometimes parenting means making difficult decisions in the moment to prevent everyone else's well-being. And that doesn't mean the child is bad. It actually means that it also doesn't mean that you failed as a parent. It just means you're responding to a situation in front of you. So later on, when everything is calm and quiet, that's the opportunity to talk about what happened and what could be done differently next time, and how everyone can work together. So children learn not only from consequences, but also from conversation, consistency, and being around and being a good role model and teaching them self-control. So sometimes people hear conversations about boundaries and immediately they start thinking that we're talking about control. And that's not my goal here. I'm not interested in raising children who simply obey because someone is bigger or louder. I'm interested in helping children develop the ability to make thoughtful decisions. And as parents, we have more life experience, so we've seen consequences that our children haven't even experienced yet. So when we set limits, ideally those limits come from love and a desire to keep our children safe, and not from a desire to dominate them. So, as kids start growing up and they mature, we gradually shift from giving direction to help them reason through a situation on their own. And that's one of the most rewarding part of parenting and homeschooling, is watching your child begin to think independently while still making wise choices. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes years and it takes a lot of patience. And there's going to be mistakes, so there's going to be trial and error. And it really takes grace for, our children and for ourselves. So if you've been listening to the show for a while, you know that one of my biggest beliefs is this, that learning doesn't end when the school day ends, when the bell rings. Whether your child attends public school, private school, a charter school, or whatever it is, homeschooling, children often benefit from individualized instruction that meets them where they are. That's why I offer online Zoom classes and one-on-one tutoring. And I am a credentialed teacher with experience working with students across a range of learning levels. I focus on making learning engaging, practical, and confidence building. Every child learns differently, and my goal is to adapt instruction to fit your child's needs rather than expecting every child to learn exactly the same way. So my services include support in reading, writing, math, homework help, enrichment activities, and of course individualized instruction for children that are being homeschooled. I also work with parents who simply want ideas for extending learning at home without turning their home into a traditional classroom. So if you're interested in learning more about my online classes or tutoring service, I'd love to connect with you. All right, now let's get back to the episode. So one thing I've learned over the years is that homeschooling is often presented in extremes. Some people say it's the greatest educational decision they've ever made. Others will say it's impossible unless you're a certified teacher. And usually the truth falls somewhere in the middle. Some days homeschooling feels wonderful. It really does. Your child is understanding the lesson. You have meaningful conversation, and the learning just happens naturally. And other days, you wonder if you've made the biggest mistake of your life because your child doesn't want to cooperate, doesn't want to listen, he doesn't want to look at you, and nothing seems to be working. You even might feel like you question yourself. You compare yourself to other people you see on even YouTube or people you've met around town. And maybe you begin thinking, maybe I should just enroll my child somewhere else. And if you've ever had those thoughts, you're not alone. Every educational setting has difficult days. Public schools also have difficult days with students. That's why they do a lot of differentiated learning. That's something you could do too with your child. Private schools also have difficult kids. Teachers have difficult days. Parents have, bad days too. Children have a tough time sometimes also. They have their tough days. So changing educational setting doesn't automatically eliminate every challenge. Sometimes it's just helps, and sometimes the same behavior or struggle simply shows up in a different environment. And that doesn't mean a different school is the wrong choice. Sometimes it truly is the best option, and the opportunity to think about is to recognize that there isn't one educational model that that guarantees success and in graduating your child, and doesn't mean that this is going to be the same for every kid. So one thing I want parents to hear out is that you don't have to do everything by yourself. Sometimes homeschooling means joining a co-op and hiring a tutor. It also can mean that you can take your child to a community college for enrichment classes, or at your local, area when your child is a certain age. And sometimes it means enrolling your child in an art class, in music, something that they seem to be interested in, robotics or sports. So sometimes it means asking, relatives for help. So, you will need days where, you have in time for yourself. And so that, that finding another homeschooling family can also be helpful. At the end of the day, education has always been a community effort. Even in traditional schools, teachers don't work alone. There are counselors, speech therapists, occupational therapists, reading specialists, school psychologists, administrators, paraprofessionals. So education has never been one person doing everything. So why should parents expect themselves to do everything alone? Asking for help is not failure. It's actually wisdom. So yeah, you might want to find somewhere what's available in your community that fits your budget and your time. So moving forward, one thing I've noticed about homeschooling parents is that they often feel like they have to defend themselves. People ask questions like, but what about socialization? Are they going to be behind? Are they getting enough opportunities? Sometimes those questions come from genuine curiosity, and sometimes they come from misunderstanding. Whatever the reason, you need to remember that you know your child better than anyone else. That doesn't mean you'll always have the perfect answer. It doesn't mean you'll never make mistakes, but confidence doesn't come from perfection. Confidence comes from thoughtfully making decisions based on your family's needs. Stay open to learning and adjusting when something isn't working. The same is true if your child attends a public or private school. Parents remain their child's strongest advocate. School educate children, families raise the children. And those are different roles, and both, of course, matter. So let's shift gears for a moment and talk about technology. Again, I love technology. I'm using it. And if you've been listening to previous episodes, I'm not someone who believes technology is automatically bad. In fact, we're recording a podcast again. I teach online. Technology always allows families to access incredible educational resources that simply didn't exist 20 years ago. but every new tool deserves thoughtful evaluation. So recently there's been discussions about AI tools used at schools, and some schools have adopted systems that help communicate with families, send attendance, reminders, or answer frequently asked questions. Those tools can save time and help families stay informed. At the same time, it's responsible for parents and educators to ask thoughtful questions like, how is student information being handled, and what data is being collected, and who has access to this information, and how accurate are the responses? You can also, you might also be wondering, how much decision making should we hand over to AI? And these are questions, that are driven in fear. They're questions also driven by responsibility. We want, safety. We want to make sure our children are safe. Their personal data is safe, and not getting into the wrong hands. As well as our own personal information. But our children, we really need to save their information because, that's another discussion, I guess. When should they have a digital footprint? And if they do, like how is that all being handled? And a chatbot might answer a routine question, but it cannot replace the trust that develops between a parent and teacher, and who know a child personally. It cannot replace professional judgment. It cannot replace empathy. And technology, remember, it's a tool. It's not a person. And so, that makes us wonder about AI. And, like any tool, it can be used wisely or poorly. So we have to be careful. And there has been some discussion there at a recent article that I came across by the BBC. And this just reminds me of something I think about often. Sometimes we assume that if a school adopts a program, it must automatically be the best choice. Sometimes we assume that if a popular parenting influencer recommends something, it must work for everyone. And we assume that because everyone else is doing something, we should too. And if we look at history, and it teaches us that popularity and wisdom are not always the same thing. That's why critical thinking is so important. We have to ask questions, and we need to listen respectfully to people with different perspectives, and then make a thoughtful decision based on the evidence, your values, and your child's needs. That applies whether you're choosing a curriculum, evaluating technology, selecting a school, or deciding how to spend your family time. Critical thinking isn't just an academic skill, it really is a life skill. Now, I wanted to also talk about other things that have been on my mind. I listen to a lot of music. I really enjoy classical music, and especially classic rock. And I've been listening to the Kings a lot recently, and then I started looking up their history and interviews, and I didn't realize that the two, the singer and the guitarist, were siblings. So if you don't know who the Kings are, for those of you who may not know, they were one of the most influential British rock bands of the 1960s. They were there in line with the Beatles. But there was a time period where they got banned from the U.S., so they weren't heard much of. They didn't gain that traction because the Beatles were not banned. So you may not recognize the band's name immediately, but you might recognize some of their songs, like "You Really Got Me," "You Got Me So I Can't," something like that. "You Really Got Me," and then there's "Lola," "Lo Lo 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 Lola." And then there's Waterloo Sunset, another great song, Sunny Afternoon. And so the Kings were not just a band that created catchy songs. They're one of the things that made they're just really unique, and they had a really interesting history. And they told their music in a storytelling kind of way and showing nostalgia. And a lot of their music reflected a love for the past, especially the traditions, the fashion, and culture of earlier decades. So Ray Davies is the band's main songwriter, often looked at as the British life with a sense of curiosity and fascination. And again, their music had an appreciation for style and atmosphere of the early 1920s, and that I really enjoyed that era when I look back at it too. And so I really connected with this band because that era represents a time of change and creativity and transformation. I mean, the 20s were known for jazz, new forms of art, changing society and social expectations. I mean, the way that people dressed suddenly changed, the fashion changed, and the people experimenting with new ways of expressing themselves. So for the Kings, looking back at early periods was not simply about saying the past was better or something like that. It was more about asking, what can we learn from the way people lived before us? And these are great questions that you can talk with your children about. What traditions are worth keeping, and what changes shaped who we are today. That idea connects deeply to education and parenting because every generation does the same thing. We look back and then we decide what we want to carry forward. We decide what we want to change. So parents do this all the time. We think about how we were raised. We then think about what worked, and we think about what didn't work. We think about the kinds of childhood we wanted to create for our own children. And just like the Kings, explore the tensions between the old and the new, parents today are also navigating a changing world. Technology has changed childhood drastically. Schools have changed. From the family structures have changed so much, and the way children communicate has also changed. But some things remain timeless, like respect, being responsible, being curious, being creative, and connecting with others. And then the other thing that I found fascinating about this band is that the brothers themselves represented the challenges of a balancing individuality and family. For example, Ray and Dave were incredibly talented, but they were also very different people. They had their disagreements, they had creative conflicts, and they had moments where working together was difficult. And so if you have, you're homeschooling, since I'm homeschooling, it resonated with me because how my children sometimes they quarrel, but they also so this looking at their history, I noticed that it created something meaningful together, and that's the lesson. Families don't have to agree on everything to love each other. Siblings don't have the same personalities. They don't need it to support each other. Conflict is not always a sign that something is broken. Sometimes it shows us that, that we need to be patient and communicate and understand each other a little bit more. And that is why, exactly why family relationships are so important. Because before children go out into the world and work with strangers, they practice relationship with the people closest to them. Home is where they learn how to forgive and apologize, to listen to each other, to compromise and take turns, to disagree and then to repair. So the goal isn't to create a family where nobody ever argues. The goal is to create a family where people learn how to handle challenges together. And this is something that your child will learn at school as well, but they're going to be practicing this with other children that they might never see again, And I feel like we should be teaching our children at home these they need to develop these tools. It's really important because their siblings should be a part of their lives for a really long time. And maybe that's one reason the kings continue to be remembered decades later, and they come up. Their music wasn't just about songs, it was about people, relationships, change, and memory. And anytime you listen to these songs, like, you can feel a connection and the complicated beauty of being human. So I wanted to continue on and now talk and focus the shift on current events in education. So recently there has been news surrounding the LAUSD and the superintendent, Alberto, who recently gave his resignation. And whenever there is a leadership change in a large school district, it creates questions. And what direction will the district go? What priorities will change? How will decisions impact students, teachers, and families? Large educational systems are complicated. There are millions of decisions happening at different levels. And this is another reminder of why parents should stay informed. You don't have to be involved in every meeting. You don't have to know every single policy. But parents should be need to understand what is happening in their child's educational environment, and ask those questions, stay connected, know who is making the decisions that affect your family. One thing I want to emphasize is that being involved doesn't mean being against schools. It doesn't mean assuming teachers or administrators are your enemy. Most educators enter this profession because they care about children and educating the children. At the same time, parents have an important role. You are your child's advocate. You know your kid. You know their personality. You know their strengths and their weaknesses. So a strong educational partnership happens when families and schools communicate honestly. So for parents who homeschool, I want to leave you with something. You are not required to have everything figured out one day. Okay? Your homeschool will change. Your child will change. Your methods will change. What worked last year might not work this year, okay? Because they're growing up. That doesn't mean you failed. That doesn't mean you're paying. This actually means that you're paying attention. The same way children learn through trial and error, parents learn that way too. We adjust, we reflect, we try again. That's part of the process. So as I wrap up today's episode, I want to return to where we started. There is no parenting playbook. There's no perfect teacher material. There's no single educational path that works for every child. What works is being willing to observe, listen, learn, and think critically. And this is a child-friendly approach. And to make decisions based on your child, not based on fear, pressures, or comparisons. Whatever your child is in a traditional school setting or learning at home, remember, you're not just managing assignments. You're raising a person, a future adult, a future friend, a future coworker, a future parent. The small moments matter. The conversations matter. The boundaries matter. And most of all, the love matters. And actually, yeah, even the difficult moments matter too, because those are often the moments where we learn the most. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you enjoy this episode, share it with another parent who is navigating the journey, or you can also tell me what you think on the comments down below, what you think of the show. What do you want the next episode to be about? What are your questions? I really want to hear from you. So I want you to remember, learning doesn't only happen in the classroom. It happens everywhere. It also happens everywhere. See you next time.